Today I'm interviewing my grandpa Tim, my mom's dad, and this is our grandparent interview. School. What technology did your school have?
Well, I went to school from 1959 to 1963, so the majority of our technology was movie projectors and overhead slide projector things. We had typewriters, and really that was about it.
Alright, what subjects were you required to take?
Well, I was in the college preparatory track in high school, so we had to have 4 years of math. So I took algebra, geometry, algebra 2, and trigonometry. 3 years of science, so I took biology, chemistry, and physics. And we had English all 4 years, and 2 years of foreign language. And I took Latin.
Okay, how many hours a day did you go, and when did you start and finish the year?
We started school in August and finished right after Memorial Day, or right before Memorial Day, because I went to school in Indiana, and high school was always out before the Indy 500, which was Memorial Day. We went to school at 8 o'clock, and we were out at 3.
Did you do any extracurricular activities, and what was offered?
Most of my extracurricular activities were athletics. I played football, basketball, baseball, ran track. I was also in High Y, which was a Christian athletic organization. As a senior, I had a part in the senior play. There were lots of other things that were offered for kids. There were FAA, which was Future Farmers of America, because we were an agricultural area, so there were kids in FFA. There was Sunshine, I think, for the girls. There was a chemistry club, there was a math club, there was a yearbook club, and of course there were the drama and choir things.
Alright, how was discipline in school handled?
Pretty much discipline in school was handled if you weren't behaving in class, you were sent to the principal's office, and the principal and the dean of boys or the dean of girls took care of the discipline.
How did you get to and from school?
As a freshman and sophomore, my parents took me to school, and then of course I would stay after school for whatever team I was practicing with, and a multitude of people would bring me home. Sometimes my mom, sometimes my dad, sometimes one of their friends, sometimes one of my friends' parents. As a junior and senior, I had a car and I drove myself to school.
A lot like me. How much homework did you have on average?
Probably 2 to 3 hours a night.
Was there a dress code, and what styles were popular?
There definitely was a dress code. We couldn't wear jeans to school. Boys had to always have pants with a belt, and you always had to wear a shirt with a collar. There were no t-shirts allowed.
How many people attended your school?
The entire school, all four, because I was in a 4-year high school, so about 400.
400. Did you go to school past high school? Where, when, and how many in your family went to college?
All of the members of my family went to college. My mom was a nurse, so she went to college and then went to nurses training and was a graduate nurse, a bachelor's nurse. My father went to school twice, actually. He was a teacher first and had a master's degree in music. And after he taught school for a period of time, he went back to medical school at Indiana University and became a doctor. My older brother went to Purdue and was a graduate electrical engineer. I went to undergraduate school at Indiana University, got a degree in education with a major in biology and a minor in chemistry. Then I taught school for 5 years after graduation, and then I went back to medical school at Northwestern in Chicago to study physical therapy and got a degree in physical therapy.
Okay, what did you want to do career-wise after high school? Is that what you ended up doing?
Because my dad was a doctor, and I used to go with him when I was a little boy, like 4 or 5. I had a tiny little bag that said Dr. Tim, and I would make house calls with my dad, because in those days the doctors went to patients' homes and saw them at home. They would come to his office, but not mostly, but a lot of times he made house calls. So growing up, it was just assumed that I would be a doctor and be an orthopedic surgeon. And at graduation from high school, that was my intent. But then some things happened. My dad died when I was a senior in high school. My mother died 51 weeks later when I was a freshman in college. And I was just lost for a bit. So my dreams of going to medical school didn't really happen. Became a teacher, then went back and became a physical therapist, which in the end was a fabulous career and something I'm very glad that happened.
All right, on to spare time. What did you do for fun and what were your hobbies?
Well, for fun, like all guys at that time and girls of that time, we were kids of the 50s and 60s, so if you've ever seen Happy Days, we were kind of those kind of kids. Fun was hanging out with your friends, as you said. In our days, we would go cruising. We'd drive up and down Main Street, meet our friends at the root beer stand, and we would, of course, boys played basketball and football and hockey and all kinds of stuff. So my hobbies were athletics and being with my friends. And I enjoyed sometimes working with my dad, who was quite a craftsman and very good with his hands, and he loved woodworking. So I would do some things like that. But most of my stuff was just with my friends.
Okay. What type of music did you listen to? Like, what kind of bands?
Well, there was only one kind of band when we grew up, and that was rock and roll.
Rock and roll.
Bill Haley and the Comets, Elvis. I mean, we were the advent of rock and roll. In fact, when you're in the car with us, you usually always hear hits of the 50s and 60s because we were the original rock and rollers.
What was your first job? How many hours did you work? What was the pay? And what did you spend your money on?
If you're asking my first job, like a job where I really went to work and got a paycheck, my first real job was at the Orthopedic Equipment Company in Bourbon, Indiana. There I did everything from inspect bone screws. I also helped measure patients for artificial limbs and helped make walkers and canes and some artificial limbs as well. I had small other jobs as a young teenager. Problem for me was I was young in my class. I graduated from high school when I was 17, so I couldn't really get a job till I was 16. So I was a junior in the summer of my junior year before I really started. I had other little jobs cutting grass and that stuff, but my first real job was Orthopedic Equipment Company.
When did you start dating, and where did you go, and how did you get there?
Well, if you really, I guess you call it dating, my first real date that I thought was when I was in the 6th grade.
Oh.
Kathy Dye and I walked from her house downtown to see the movies and came home.
Oh, sounds good. Well, obviously you played sports, and this question is, did you play any sports?
I did. I was very fortunate growing up because I had a brother who was 8 years older. So he drugged me everywhere when he was an athlete, mostly because my mom and dad made him, not because he wanted to. So when he was a senior in high school, I was a 4th grader or 5th grader, so I was always at the high school catching footballs, doing whatever. So when I got to high school, I played everything. I played football, I played basketball, I played baseball, I ran track. I loved to water ski, so I everything we had at school I did.
All right. On to entertainment. When did you get your first color TV, computer, and car?
Whoa. Our first color TV was probably about 1953, maybe 54. My first computer, gosh, I'm guessing, I don't know, 75, 70, no, that wasn't even then. Probably in the 90s. When we finally bought a computer. My first car, I got the day I was 16 years old in 1960. It was a car my dad had in the garage. I was raised in a town of only about 8,000 people. And my dad was only one of 3 doctors in town, and oftentimes people would owe a medical bill to my dad, but they didn't have the money to pay. So he would come home with chickens or food or things that people would pay. And my first car was given to my father by Mrs. Baker. Her husband had died, and she didn't drive, and she couldn't pay my dad her medical bill, so she said, I know Tim's going to be driving soon, so why don't you just take this car, 1957 yellow and white Chevrolet, and you just keep it for Tim. So my first car was given to me by George Baker's wife.
All right. Who were your best friends? What type of people were they, and do you still see them today?
My longest friend in life is named Bob Danielson. I met him when I was in kindergarten. Bob was 5 years older than I was. As a kindergartner, I went to school half a day, and then the second half of the day I stayed at my dad's medical office because my mom was his nurse. And so my job was to play with the babies or do whatever. And one day I was outside of my dad's office, and there was a boy across the street, and I yelled across the street and said, hey kid, do you want to play ball? We started playing catch, and we're still friends to this day. Probably my other long friend that you know is Reverend Ron Naylor.
Yep.
And his wife Susan. Ron and I were classmates in the 3rd grade. He moved to town, and we see them every year, and his wife Susan joined us in the 7th grade, and of course we're still friends to this day.
Was there much peer pressure, and if there was, what was like to do what?
No, there wasn't much peer pressure that I remember. We probably, the biggest thing when we were going to high school was the hoods, the hoodlums. the guys with the greasy hair, and they tried to be tough guys. And there was just a little, when maybe as we got to be juniors and seniors in high school, about would you drink a beer? That was pretty taboo. Or kids trying to sneak a cigarette maybe, but there was really not a lot of that peer pressure. If kids did that, they did it. Nobody forced you to do it, or at least nobody forced me to.
Who were the popular people of the time? The actors, the sports people, the music people?
Well, the actors of the time I guess there were probably, of course, there were the teenage heartthrobs, Annette Funicello and the Mickey Mouse Club, and Frankie Avalon. Elvis was making a bunch of movies. Sandra Dee, those kind of people. You know, look at me, I'm Sandra Dee. If you ever saw Grease, why, that was kind of us. The sports people at that time, the Yankees were Yogi Berra and Mickey Mantle. I'm a lifelong Cubs fan, so Ernie Banks was my favorite guy. So those were, and you know, football players, Frank Gifford, who passed away not too long ago, Sam Huff, Bart Starr, all those kind of people.
Where were the favorite hangout spots?
There were two at our in our town. The root beer stand. We had one on each corner of the city, so you could go out to the root beer stand on North Jefferson, and then you made a loop all the way back through town, and you went to Casey's, which was on the south side of town. So we kind of had a drag that we ran. And the other place that was favorite was Bart's Fiesta Grill. It was a hamburger joint downtown where kids would go after school and have hamburgers and french fries and hang out and drink cherry cokes and all that kind of stuff. I didn't get to do much of that because I was always at practice. But when I got to be when I was a senior and had a part in the senior play, I went with folks down there, and I remember saying to Reverend Naylor, I said, "You guys do this every day after school?" He said, "Yes." Man, look what I've been missing for 4 years. So.
Family. What did your parents do for a living?
My dad was a doctor. My mom was his nurse.
What chores did you have to do?
My biggest chore was cutting the yard and taking care of our grass in the summer. Sure, you had to pick up your clothes, take out the garbage. We had like 5 acres where I lived, and about 3 of those were grass. And it took me about 7 hours each Saturday to cut the grass because it was a push more, a lot of work. And then in the back, we had a couple acres that my dad used as his garden, he said. And you'd have to hoe the beans and the corn and stuff. And then we raised cattle for a couple years. And I always loved to shovel out the barn. So.
What rules did you have to follow at home?
Rules were pretty simple for me. Had to make good grades, had to be on the honor roll. And in that day, you had to have 3 A's and no C's to be on the honor roll. The basic rules were you didn't go out during the week. You could be out till 11 or 11:30 on Saturday night, and you were home on Sunday.
How many people were in your family, and name them?
Well, there were 4 in my family. My dad, Dr. Paul S. Connell, my mom, Grace, my older brother Tom, and myself.
Did your family have any pets, and who took care of them?
Oh yeah, we had lots of pets. We had, we raised rabbits, We raised chickens, and the baby chicks were always my favorite. But I had two Irish setters growing up. I had one, and he was killed, and then we got another. We had two beagle hounds. We had a cocker spaniel that was my Uncle Warren's, that came to live with us when he went to the war. And then we had a goat,
A
pet goat named Surefoot.
What did your family do on vacations?
My mom and dad, well, I don't know about my mom, but my dad loved to fish. My mom learned to fish. And so they would go fishing. They would go, I remember them going to Tennessee to fish one year. And then when I was in junior high and high school, they found a place up in northern Michigan in Rapid River, where they built a cottage and went north to Michigan to go walleye fishing.
What role did your mom play in your family? How about your dad? And who did what at home?
My family was a little different. At that time, again, growing up, we were one of the few families where both of my parents worked. They both worked in the office, so my dad was the doctor, my mom was the nurse. And besides being the nurse, she was the bookkeeper, and she certainly ordered all the supplies and so forth. My dad was also the coroner and the county health officer, so my mom also ran the county health office when issued birth certificates and things like that. And the roles were reversed at home. My dad loved to cook, so my dad was the cook. My mom was the dishwasher. And while my parents were at their office, we had a housekeeper who was my second mom, is what I call her. Her name was Isabel, or Izzy for me. And Izzy was my second mom. And I know you know the Brady Bunch, they had an Alice. Well, Izzy was our Alice.
How many times did you move growing up, and where did you live?
We lived in northern Indiana and Plymouth, Indiana, which is about 25 miles south of South Bend. I never moved. I was in Plymouth my whole time.
Did your family have to endure any hard times, and how did they overcome them?
We didn't have, if you're meaning hard times like hard economic times or loss of work, no, we didn't have that. My dad was a doctor. We had plenty of hard times later on. As I said, when I was a senior in high school, my dad died. And of course that turned us completely upside down. And then 51 weeks later, my mother died. But in terms of the losing jobs or having to, no, my dad was the doctor and he loved what he did.
At what age did you get married, and how did you meet your spouse?
Let's see, I was 22 when we got married. Had just graduated from college. I met my spouse in summer school at Indiana University in a sociology class.
Where did your spouse and you live when you first got married?
Well, I'll answer that with two statements. We got married when we were seniors in college, right at Christmas time. Because that year was the year Indiana went to the Rose Bowl. So we were married 2 days before Christmas and spent our honeymoon at the Rose Bowl. And then we came back to Indiana University, and we still had about 2 months of school left to go to finish our college education. No, I guess it had been 1 month. It was at the end of January when we finally finished. So we had an apartment in Bloomington for about 2 or 3 months, but lived there only 1 month. We lived there together as a couple for 1 month. I lived in it before we were married. Then we moved to Michigan City, Indiana, where we both were teachers and started our life there.
At what age did you have children?
25, I believe. Yeah, your Aunt Jen was born in December of 1970.
How did you end up in Port Huron?
That's a very interesting story, really. I ended up here because a recruiter called our hospital looking for physical therapists. Mercy Hospital needed a director of physical therapy, and this recruiter had the assignment of trying to fill the position. He called the hospital one day, and one of the secretaries at our hospital said there was a call for me. So I took the call, and this guy said, now he had a job in Port Huron, Michigan. Would I be interested? I said, no, I'm no interest in moving. End of story. About 6 weeks later, he called back and said, I think you should consider Port Huron, Michigan. I said, I have no idea where Port Huron, Michigan is. We lived in southern Indiana, in Columbus, Indiana. He finally convinced me that I should accept an opportunity to come visit Port Huron. So I did. And then I went back home, and they offered me the job at that time. And went back home, and I talked to your grandma about it, and we said, nah, we can't do it. So I turned it down. The short story was, I was offered the job 3 more times. I turned it down 2 more times. Finally, the last time I took it, and we came to Port Huron.
New events. What do you remember about World War II or the Korean War?
Well, I remember nothing about World War II because it was over. I was born in 1945 and the war had just ended. However, I brought for you some pictures about World War II for us. This is a picture of my dad in his Army uniform. He was a physician in the war in New Orleans, Louisiana, stationed there at the Marine Hospital. And your other great-grandfather, or grandma's dad, Wilbur, was a hard hat diver in World War II. He was a salvage diver, and he was the guy with the big hard hats that would build landing sites for ships and come in after the troops had taken over the location, so that the United States soldiers could build a base there. So we certainly have a lot of family connections. And then we brought for you a look. You can see the little ration books that our parents kept of how life was then. But for me, the war was over. I was born just after the war ended. What was the other?
Korean War.
Korean War, I was only about 5, so I don't remember much about the Korean War, except really one thing I heard stories about from my grandmother, my mom's mother, who lost her only son. My Uncle Warren was a pilot, and he died as a result of World War II. He flew soldiers back from the engagement area, or from the hospital areas at the war, and he would fly injured soldiers back to the United States, and he contracted malaria and ended up dying as a result of the diseases that he caught from the soldiers as he brought them back. But my grandmother was just bitter angry that she lost her son, and 5 years later we were back in the war again. She hated the president. She hated the war. She didn't want to talk about Korea.
Um, what do you remember about the Vietnam War?
Oh, I remember a lot about Vietnam because that was my generation's war. In fact, when we were in college, kids who graduated from college then were drafted and went to Vietnam. Uh, I had taken I got drafted and took a draft physical, and I was soon to be inducted into the Army. But I was an education major and got a teaching job, so therefore I got a deferment and didn't have to go. Vietnam was a very controversial war. There were a lot of demonstrations and protests on college campuses. I had friends who were killed in Vietnam, friends whose lives were never the same because of Vietnam. There were certainly a lot of nights in college where we would talk. If you got drafted, would you go to Canada and leave the country to avoid the draft? Most everybody did not do that, but some did. But it was very controversial and very unpopular.
What do you remember about the first man on the moon?
I remember staying up all night watching that. That was amazing. As a kid, and even growing up, I was a space freak. I loved the astronauts. I loved the space program. I always wanted to be at Cape Canaveral at some time when a rocket took off. So I remember Neil Armstrong walking on the moon and was just spellbound.
JFK's assassination.
Yes, I was a freshman in college. In fact, I was in a class. This is really ironic. I was in ROTC class, which is, at that time, we were a land grant college in Indiana, so all men had to take ROTC for the first 2 years, which is we dressed like soldiers, and we had to, at Indiana, we had Air Force or Army. And so we drilled like soldiers, we had parades like soldiers, we took tests about the military in preparation for the fact there was a draft that we were going to the military. This particular day that the president was shot, I was in ROTC class. Actually, I wasn't. I was in a French lab. They broke in the French lab and said the president had been shot, and the class just ended. I walked across, basically just across the driveway to my ROTC class, and there were probably 400 kids in that class, and you could have heard a pin drop. We just sat motionless, waiting to hear. The guy who was teaching the class was a captain in the Air Force. He was crying. We just waited, and of course, he died. But that was a cold day in November. Certainly remember that day.
Woodstock Music Festival or protest movements?
Neither was I involved with or cared about. I thought the people at Woodstock were freaks and long-haired weirdo hippies. Had no use for them, no interest in them, and could have cared less about them. Pretty much the same in the protest movement. Had no use for it, no care. The mainstream people, if our country was involved and you were drafted and you went to the service, you went to the service because that's what you needed to do. We didn't like it, but our generation did it. But there were certainly plenty of protesters that got plenty of publicity, and the mainstream hated them. We didn't like them at all. We didn't confront them, whatever. We just ignored them.
The Watergate? What do you remember about that?
Wasn't a big political fan. Thought it was kind of stupid, actually. What I at the time wasn't really very interested. I found it hard to believe that the president could lose his job, and at the same time, I guess I found it hard to believe that the president would lie to the country. But it wasn't. It was a sad day, and I was embarrassed for our country and for us as a nation, but didn't really think it was a big deal, honestly.
The Challenger explosion?
I was in your Aunt Jen's family room that day when it exploded, and was heartbroken. Again, I loved the space program. For that to happen just didn't seem right. We knew astronauts had died before. Gus Grissom had burned on the launch pad in preparation for a flight, but to see it explode was heartbreaking.
Invasion of Iraq for the first time.
Watched it on CNN, actually, and remember saying, "We're watching a war. How do you watch a war on television?" That seemed very strange to me. That was after 9/11, and certainly it seemed at the time that our country was righting and responding to a wrong that had been done to us, but it just seemed very strange to watch things explode. I mean, you see it in the movies, you never thought you'd see it for real.
MTV and Live Aid.
Not my thing. MTV, I had no interest in. Live Aid, certainly a good cause, just nothing that I got engaged with.
What was the biggest event of your life?
Well, I don't know that I could say there's a biggest event. There were certainly many major events. The death of my parents, getting married, the birth of my children, the birth of my grandchildren,
That's me!
graduating from medical school, not one more than the other, just all part of the composite that makes up your life.
9/11.
Again, heartbreaking. Certainly remember 9/11 just like I remember the president's death. I was with the CEO of the hospital. I was a vice president at Mercy at that point. We were in the waiting room of the Women's Center. We had been making rounds just as we would do often to check on employees and see if things were good and what they had to tell us and stuff. And we sat down there in the waiting room and watched on television the tower crumble.
These are just extras. Compare the teens of today with your generation. Nothing like your generation.
Well, nothing like our generation, because you know the honesty, and we, Grandma and I have talked about this a lot. Life when we were teenagers was just simple. Again, if you watch Happy Days, it was carefree. It was being a teenager in the 50s and 60s was wonderful. Happy-go-lucky, carefree, no wars at our time as teenagers. Life was fun. We didn't face drugs, we didn't face war, we didn't face assassins, we didn't face terrorists. Life was pretty simple. Kids today, I don't know how kids today can deal with everything. The internet has just changed the world so much And kids today have so many more things. Life for us was fairly simple. Kids today with computers and cell phones and all of the stuff that you all have is just much more complex. So I think it's harder to be a kid today than it was then. Although I'll tell you, I think in our generation, our teenagers were much more committed and dedicated than kids today are.
What did some things cost then compared to now, like gas or a car or your home or
Well,
gas?
well, gas was fun. As I said, when we used to
Fun.
drive around to the root beer stand, you had 4 people in the car. Everybody threw in a quarter. You could buy $1 worth of gas, and you could drive around all night. If everybody threw in 50 cents, my goodness, we had not only enough gas to drive around, we had enough to eat with. So certainly things were much cheaper. We bought our first Volkswagen Bug when Grandma and I were married as a second car for $1,995, and that was a Volkswagen Beetle. What else did you ask?
A home.
Home. Our first home was $29,000 in Columbus, Indiana, in 1972.
What would you do differently in your life if you had a chance?
What would I do differently?
Yeah.
Probably would have been more dedicated and worked harder as an undergraduate college student, even though the things I had to deal with, I wish I would have been able to find ways for help to get through that better and work harder at that. That's probably the biggest thing I would change.
Last question. What has been the most important technological advance in your lifetime?
Ooh, the most important technological advance in my lifetime. I would think the space program was the most important technological advance because that brought to us so many things of today. It brought us computers. It brought in, with that, we learned so much more about the Earth and weather patterns and all the other things, the physics and the science and the biology because of that. Certainly you can't understate computers. They used to fill a whole room, now you hold them in your hand. So that's certainly a big change. I will tell you one thing that I think often about is my grandparents changed. My grandmother, who grew up in the horse and buggy era, who never learned to drive, but we had a man on the moon before she died. Wow, the changes she experienced were amazing. But for us, I guess I would say I think the space program was the greatest technological advance.
All right, that was my grandparent interview with my grandpa.